settings, which are located in our post-process volume. So find out where your post-process volume is. As a reminder, you could create a post-process volume by coming up to Add, Volumes, and Post-process volume, and make sure in your post-process volume that Infinite Extent Unbound is turned on, because otherwise our post-process volume will not be affecting our entire world. So you want to come down all the way inside the post-process volume to Global Illumination, and by default Lumen is turned on, and we get a bunch of Lumen settings under Lumen Global Illumination. So first off, to get rid of that noise, check Final Gather Quality and increase it from 1 to 4. Now we can see that noise slowly start to disappear, and there is a lot less noise. We can even increase this to 10, and now our scene definitely looks a lot better. So if we hover over any of these settings, it gives us a very quick description. While Final Gather Quality does get rid of the noise, it also comes at the cost of GPU. So just keep that in mind, that if you do increase Final Gather Quality, you might lose on some performance. There are also some other settings, which I'm going to go over in the next chapter. That's the basics of lighting in UE5. Now we're going to take the knowledge that we just learned and apply it to lighting an architectural visualization scene. First, we're going to light the environment by using lumen and movable lights. Then we're going to light the same exact environment, but with static and baked lighting. So we're going to compare the two methods of getting global illuminations and see their pros and cons. The specific architectural environment is already included within our lighting examples that we migrated into our first project. We can see under lighting examples maps, it's the map that's right next to the map that we've been editing, which is light bounce. So let's double click on ArcViz Room, and we won't see anything because there are no lights. If I press Alt and 3, or if I click on Unlit from the view mode, that this environment is just a simple room with some furniture and a window from which all our light is going to come from. So a very simple room, which will help us learn and get the gist of how to light a scene in Unreal Engine. I'm going to press Alt and 4 as a shortcut to go back into our default view mode. Now the first light I'm going to add in is the main light, which is the sun. So let's add in a directional light, and I'm going to rotate it so that the sun is coming through the window. And already, especially right here, we can see global illumination and lumen at work. So I want to find a nice angle. I think right there is pretty good, but if we look outside, there is no sky. It kind of looks scary just seeing an endless black void. So let's add in a sky by coming back up here to visual effects and the sky and atmosphere. So drag that in, but half of our world, the bottom half, is still a black void. We can hide that black void with fog. So come back up to add visual effects, and below sky and atmosphere, we have exponential height fog. Simply drag that in. And now if we look outside the window, all we see is sky, which is what I want. But there is a little bit of an issue, and that is if we hide and unhide the exponential height fog, we can see that there is a little bit of fog inside of our room, and we don't want that. So within the exponential height fog, one of the settings we're going to change is right here, start distance. I'm going to drag this all the way up to its max of 5,000. So essentially start distance is saying, do not use fog until we're 5,000 centimeters away from our camera. So now if I hide and unhide it, we don't have any fog inside our room. There is one more light that I want to add to our room, and that is the skylight. So let's come to lights, skylight, and drag it in. So we can already see that our room got a little bit of a bluish tint from our sky. I can hide and unhide it right here. So effects world, turn it off and turn it back on. So we can see that it does make a little bit of a difference. So I'm going to set the skylight to movable and also set the sun to movable. Since both of these lights are being used with lumen, we aren't baking any lights. And another thing I'm going to do is add in a post-process volume. Since if we come over here, and I don't know if it's noticeable in the YouTube video, but there is a little bit of noise. So we can get rid of that by adding in the post-process volume. Simply drag it in and make sure you scroll down, and Infinite Extent Unbound is turned on, so we don't have to be in the post-process volume for it to take effect. Now let's zoom all the way up to Lumen Global Illumination, and right here for Final Gather Quality, instead of 1, I'm going to set that to 10, and a lot of that noise just disappeared. Also, I want to add some soft shadows to the really small objects, since right now there is no soft shadow that's being given off from the phone, the clock, or the coffee mug. So the reason why is because I have to increase the lumen scene detail right here from 1 to 4. So this was beforehand at 1, and now this is 4. So by default, to save on processing power, Lumen excludes a lot of small objects from its calculations. So you need to tell Unreal that you want them within the Lumen calculation by increasing it from 1 to 4 or even higher if you do have smaller objects. And one last edit I'm going to make to the post-process volume is setting it for a manual exposure. So under exposure, metering mode, set to manual. Bring up the exposure compensation to 13.25. It's pretty good. And also, this is an artistic choice. If we increase it, we can see that we get more bloom in our world. So maybe a value of 2. So this is without bloom and with bloom. I do think it makes the scene look a little bit nicer. And that is the basics of lighting and environments in Unreal Engine 5, specifically for architectural visualization. And since we're using Lumen, that gives us the ability with Control and L as a shortcut to rotate our sun, watch our world be updated in real time based off of our sun's lighting, which is pretty insane. Now, while Lumen is amazing, we do get some trade-offs in quality. Just because we are able to use real-time global illumination doesn't mean that it's the best case for certain scenarios, specifically a scenario like this, where there isn't going to be any moving parts since it's just an architectural visualization scene. We might as well bake our lighting because number one, baked lighting is always more performance friendly than using Lumen because Lumen does do a lot of GPU calculations behind the scenes, while baked lighting is just overlaying a texture. And number two, if you properly bake your lights into a good light map, then the quality will be better than Lumen. So let's convert our Lumen environment into a baked lighting environment. So I want to make a copy of our current level, which is ArcViz Room, by selecting it in our content drawer and pressing Ctrl and D to duplicate it. So let's call this one ArcViz Room Baked, and double click to go inside of it. Make sure we save selected. All right, great. So first thing I'm going to do is select all my lights and set my directional light to static and set my skylight also to static. Now I'm going to go into my post-process volume and disable Lumen for reflections and global illumination. So set this to none, and under reflections, also set this to none. So we can see immediately we aren't getting any global illumination. That's because I should come up to build and build all levels to start ray tracing in the background. All right, great. So here we have our baked lighting. This is really bad since we need to increase the quality of our light bakes by going into the world settings. And if I scroll up, we can see that under light mask, we have light mask settings. And in the dropdown, we have a bunch of settings that will change the quality of our light baking. So first thing, I want to increase the number of bounces, which will just illuminate our scene a little bit more. So the number of indirect lighting bounces is right now set to 3. Let's set that to 10. And also for sky lighting bounces, set this from 1 to 10. Number 2, for static lighting level scale, if we bring this below 1, for example 0.5, then we're going to get a lot more quality out of our bakes. So I'm going to set this instead of 0.5, let's set this to 0.1. And to compensate for the static lighting level scale, you want to increase the indirect lighting quality to 10. So specifically, I want to increase the indirect lighting quality to 10 because the static lighting level scale right now is set to 0.1. And generally, you want your static lighting level scale times your indirect lighting quality to equal 1. So for example, if instead of static lighting level scale being 0.1, I change it to 0.5, then the indirect lighting quality should be set to 2, since 0.5 times 2 equals 1. But I'm going to leave it at 0.1 since that does give us a better value at the cost of waiting a little bit more for the ray trace calculations to happen. And now that I like my settings, come to build and click on build all levels. So this build will take longer than beforehand because we increase the quality of our light bakes. So now this is our scene, and we didn't really notice that much of a difference since I also want to come up to build and under lighting quality, make sure that it's not set to preview. Instead, it's set to either medium, higher production. I'm just going to set to medium. And also while I'm at it, I'm going to select my post-process volume And let's bring down the bloom, since I think the bloom is too intense, to 1. And for exposure compensation, I'm going to leave it at, let's go 12.7. And now if I press build all levels, keep in mind that if you are following along exactly with this tutorial, you do not have to press build whenever I press build, since I'm building my lights a lot more frequently than I would to just demonstrate what some of these settings do. So if you want to save time and not have to wait for each build, then I would wait for the very end and copy those settings. We can see that the quality is still not the best. Because if you remember, light maps are being baked into a texture. And if that texture has low resolution, then we're going to get low resolution shadows and lighting. So we need to raise the resolution on each of our static meshes. And to see the resolution of our static mesh visually, you can come up to Lit, down to Optimization View Modes, and select Light Map Density with the shortcut Alt and 0. So right now, our entire room is pretty much blue. This is not what we want. We want our scene to be in the greenish to reddish range. So to increase the light map resolution of a static mesh, you want to select the object, and within the details panel, scroll down until you see lighting and overridden light map resolution. It's at 64. Turn that on and increase that to, let's try 128 or 256. And okay, that looks a little bit better, but since this is the floor and it will have some of the shadow, I want to increase that to 512. So make the floor pretty dense. I think the walls around it should also be, let's go 512. And the roof can also be 512. So for the baseboard, I'm going to select that and make this, let's try 256. The door needs to increase it from 64 to 128. The chair is a pretty big deal since it's our focal element. So let's go 256 right there. And for the wall is at 256. I'm going to try 512. The table is at 128. Actually, let's make this 512. The wall right here, 512. And the floor, actually, I'm going to increase this to 124. So I think this looks good. Now if we bake our lights, let's see what this gives us. So at this point, it is going to take a little while for our lights to bake, since there's a lot more detail it needs to calculate. And probably by now you understand why lumen is a pretty big deal, since it gets rid of this repetitive process of having to wait for our lighting to bake. And then if we don't like the bake, we have to change something and change some settings and then bake our lighting again. And then if we don't like that, we have to go back, and it's an entire process, while lumen just works immediately. But in this case, it is worth it since the quality is going to be better than lumen. Okay, now that we're done baking, let's see what our world looks like. And okay, that's a lot better. But the shadows, especially in between objects, are a little bit too intense, since by default, Unreal is calculating ambient occlusion. I want to disable ambient occlusion since I'm just relying on our baked light map to simulate all of our shadows and lighting. So within our post-process volume, let's go find where ambient occlusion is, which is right here under rendering features, under ambient occlusion. Intensity, let's turn that to 0 to turn it all off. And increase our exposure compensation to 13. Okay, now our scene is baked, but we are missing one last thing, and that is we don't have any reflections whatsoever. Our world looks pretty bad since we don't have those reflections. And the reason why is because Lumen calculates reflections automatically. When we bake our lighting, we have to specify where we want our reflections to be. And we do that through a sphere reflection capture. So to add a sphere reflection capture, come up to the add button, down to visual effects, and drag in a sphere reflection capture. Essentially what the sphere reflection capture does is that it takes a 360-degree snapshot from the sphere of our world, and then it uses that as the projection of our reflections. And to get a better snapshot of our world, come up to build and select build reflection captures. So right now we have one reflection capture, but we can have multiple reflection captures, since obviously it doesn't make sense for all reflections to grab from the same location. So if I duplicate this with Alt, and then if I decrease the influence radius within the details panel to, let's go 500, and place it on top of my small objects right here. And once again, come up to build and build reflection captures, we can see that these objects, instead of grabbing from this sphere reflection capture, they're grabbing from the smaller one, which is overriding the larger one. Since the reflection capture on the table is smaller, Unreal knows to pick this sphere reflection capture for all the objects within its radius of 500 centimeters. So this is essentially how you bake lighting in Unreal Engine. Now I know that the setup took a lot longer than using Lumen. Also, we had to wait a while for each light baking to happen and for all the light maps to be created and the ray tracing to happen. But in the end, in my opinion, the quality, especially right here, if I select a chair and hide it, we can see how detailed those soft shadows are. And if I unhide it, take a good look at this baked lighting scene, jump back into our ArcViz room, which is using Lumen. Obviously, the baked lighting looks a lot better. So hopefully you understand the difference between baked lighting and Lumen, their pros and cons, and why you would use baked lighting over Lumen, even though Lumen is real time. That is the very basics of lighting in Unreal Engine. Of course, you could get even more complicated because the lighting is an entire art form by itself. But hopefully you do have a good foundation to learn more. Now we're going to go over landscapes. So landscapes in Unreal are pretty important because odds are you will always be seeing a landscape or your character is on top of a landscape. So in this section, we're going to go over how we can create a landscape, sculpt it, and finally at the end, go over how to add foliage. To demonstrate how to make landscapes, let's create an entirely new map. So press Control Space and let's go into My Stuff. And right here, let's create a brand new folder called Maps, which will hold all of our maps. So I'm going to select both my map and my build data and drag it into Maps, let go, and move here. So let's jump into there and right click, create a brand new level. So by right clicking and creating a level, instead of coming up to File and New, we don't get access to the templates, which is fine. I do want to create a brand new level completely from scratch. So let's call this one Landscape Example and jump in. So let's save everything. The reason why we're starting from a blank level is because I want to show how to light an outdoor environment from scratch. Okay, to begin, let's create a landscape. To create a landscape, you need to go into landscape editing mode. To do so, come up to select mode and then select landscape. Finally, we're going to go over what some of these modes do. So you can press landscape or the shortcut is Shift and 2. So throughout this tutorial, so far we've been in select with the shortcut Shift and 1. Now we're going to go into Shift and 2 to edit our landscape. We don't have a landscape, so Unreal is going to ask us if we want to create a landscape. We see that we get a bunch of different settings that we can pick from. Generally, I don't play with these settings, I just leave it as default. But if you are going to play with those settings, I recommend you use the templates provided to you from the Unreal documentation. Type in Unreal Docs, and then type in Landscape Technical Guide. So if you are going to change any of these settings, I recommend you use the presets. For now, I'm going to use the default settings and press Create. Okay, great. Now we have a landscape, but before we start editing our landscape, it's best to light our scene so we know exactly what is happening. First off, let's add in a directional light. So add light directional light. Simply drag that in. We can leave all the settings at default, except I'm going to set to movable since I want to use completely dynamic lighting. To help us know the direction of the light and how the shadows will look like, I'm going to add in a cube temporarily to help us when we're lighting our scene. Just like that. Now, obviously, we don't want an endless black void. We want a sky. So come up to Create, Visual Effects, and select the sky and atmosphere to drag it in. And automatically it's working. If I hold down Control and L as a shortcut to rotate my sun, notice that the sky updates in real time. So as I lower my sun, the sky changes colors to represent a morning time or a dusk time. And I can raise it up to get a more bluish sky, which is pretty amazing that Unreal automatically updates your sky depending on your sun's angle. Now there are two issues. We still have a black void in the lower half of our world, and zooming in on the shadow, it's pretty dark. We're getting a little bit of global illumination and bounce lighting from our sun, but we need lighting from our sky as a whole. So to fix that, come up to Add, Lights, and drag in a skylight. Now it's recommended for skylights that under real-time capture, make sure it's turned on if you are going to use a skylight with the sky and atmosphere. And also, while we're at it, set it to movable since we're only using lumen lighting. Also, let's go fix our black void by adding in some fog to cover that. So come into Visual Effects and X Metro High Fog. simply drag it out like this. And we can control where the exponential height fog starts by moving the widget. So if I move it up, we get more fog, and if I move it down, we get less fog. So hopefully you can see what's happening. For now, I'm going to leave it in the middle right here. And with that, a directional light, sky and atmosphere, skylight, and fog is pretty much how you light 90% of open world scenes in Unreal Engine 5. It is literally that easy. And what's amazing is that all these objects interact with each other successfully. So I can move my sun around, lower it, create a really dark area, lower it to the point where it's night, and then raise it. Slowly the sun comes above the fog and starts to illuminate our world. So it's completely real-time, time of day lighting. Now that we set up the lighting, we're able to see any edits we make to our landscape. So let's finally go over the landscape editing mode. And to do so, I need to come up to my mode selector and select landscape from select, or I can press Shift and 2 as the shortcut. So by default, it's going to give us this brush right here. And as you could probably guess, hold down the left mouse button, I'm able to sculpt and raise the terrain. So left mouse button is to raise the terrain. If I hold down Shift and left mouse button, then I lower the terrain. And by default, we are using the basic sculpt brush. I can even increase the tool strength. So right now it's at 0.3. Of course, if I bring it up to 1, then our sculpts will be a lot more intense. Even holding down Shift, I can really lower the landscape's terrain. If I want to, I can control the fall off of this brush with the brush fall off. So bringing it to 0 will mean there is no fall off. So I get some insanely harsh sculpts happening. Or I can bring it all the way up to 1, which makes the fall off non-existent, giving us the smoothest brush as possible for really faint changes to our landscape. Now, a shortcut to increasing the brush size is to use the right bracket key on my keyboard. So right bracket key will increase my brush size and left bracket key will decrease it. Very similar to Photoshop shortcuts. So that's the basics of the sculpt brush. As a reminder, if you ever want to get back the default values of any property in Unreal Engine, go to that property and select the arrow right next to it to reset it back to its default value. Now let's go over the smoothing brush. And as you can guess, if you have some really harsh landscapes and you want it to be smoother, like right here, it was really harsh since our fall off was non-existent. Using the smooth brush, I can smooth away those bumps in the landscape. So pretty great. And the next brush after that is the flatten brush. So flatten brush is great for terracing, or maybe you're creating a game, for example, and let's say right here you need a flat area for your gameplay. Well, to get a flat area, of course, we need to use the flatten brush, which will just flatten our landscape. It's also great for creating terraces. So if I start my flatten brush off right here, notice how we have a higher terrace and a lower one, and right below that, another one. So we're very quickly able to create some complicated landscapes with just these 3 brushes. And these 3 brushes are the main brushes. Generally, I don't really touch any of the other brushes, except for very specific circumstances, which we aren't going to be going over in this video. Now, that's how you sculpt a landscape. But how do I paint a landscape? Since right now we're using Unreal's default material. Of course, landscapes in real life are not made out of squares. Instead, they're made up of grass, dirt, sand, rocks, and pretty much anything you would expect outside. Now, I'm going to briefly go over how to create a very basic landscape material. Create the material under My Stuff, and call this one M_landscape. Double click to open it up. And I'm going to dock it up here so I can switch in between my level and landscape. Now the difference between a normal material and a landscape material is one node, and that is landscape layer blend. So select it, and here we have the layer blend. Notice how we don't have any inputs. That's because we need to specify inputs in the details panel right here. So the inputs are essentially going to be layers. So you can have a grass layer, a dirt layer, a sand layer, and then within your landscape editing mode, we'll be able to paint on those individual layers on our landscape. So to add in a layer, select your layer blend, and under layers, click on the add button, and make sure you click on the triangles to see the drop down. Now for the first layer, call this one grass, and the second layer, call this one dirt. Now this is just for demonstration, so it's not going to look very good. But to get the point across, let's go find a grass texture and a dirt texture under starter content, textures, and I'm going to use t_ground. Also for dirt, looks like we don't have a dirt, so I'm just going to use the metal rust texture because that does look like dirt and it will get the point across. So drag in metal rust as our dirt. Now hook up grass right there and dirt, and I'll put these into base color and let's press apply. Save everything, jump back into landscape examples, and now to apply the landscape material to our landscape, we can't just drag our material onto the landscape like that. Instead, in the details panel, scroll down and get landscape material and drag on the landscape material to the slot right there and let go. But we get a really weird black texture since we need to specify where these layers are. Right now, Unreal isn't picking any layers, so it's just defaulting to black. Hop back into your landscape mode by pressing Shift and 2, and within Paint, we have our layers. So we need to create our layers and store them somewhere within our content drawer. So to create a layer, click on the Add button, and you want to select Weight Blended Layer Normal. So select that. It's going to ask us to create a new landscape layer info, and it's going to automatically create a new folder for us where our map is located called our map name and shared assets. Now we could also create a new folder by right clicking and going new folder, or we could pretty much save this anywhere else in our project, but I'm just going to leave it as default value and also leave it at the default name it's generating, which is grass_layer info. Click save. Now we have our layer right there and we can see our grass has been applied to our landscape. Let's do the same thing for dirt by clicking on the plus button and going Weight Blended Layer Normal. Select that. And for dirt_layer, also click on save at the same location. So now we have 2 layers in a folder that's right next to our maps. And go to save all. Now obviously this landscape is too shiny. So jump back into M_landscape, hold down 1 and left click to bring a constant scalar parameter and give a value of 1. So we have complete roughness to get rid of that shine. Press apply. And our landscape is looking better. But I also think we should add in normal maps to give the texture a little bit of bump to it. So come back into our landscape material and press Control and space under textures. So starter content, textures. Let's find where the grass is, which is right here. Drag out a normal map. And let's find where the normal map is for rust. And that is right there, and drag that out. So I want to blend between our normal maps, just like how we're blending between the base colors. And I could do that by copying and pasting my layer blend, which I can do with Control and D to duplicate. And plug up the normal map right there. And plug up the rust normal map right there. And put those both into normal. So now we have 2 layer blends, which are sampling from the same exact layers that we just created in our landscape editing mode. And press apply. Now let's jump into dirt and lower the brush size just a little bit. See, the tool strength is at 0.3. Holding that left mouse button, I'm now able to blend in between dirt and grass. One thing I like to do whenever I'm creating my landscape is to get a human reference. That's why I'm able to compare the size of my landscape next to a human. And this is especially helpful since one thing I want to do with M_landscape is add in texture tiling, but it's hard to know how much I should tile this texture when there isn't a human reference. So to get a human reference, you want to come up to add and add feature or content pack and select the third person. We can see that there's a mannequin right here, which we're going to be using as our reference, and select add to project. So this will add a bunch of new assets to our project. And specifically, I want to use the assets in character, mannequins, meshes, and we can do skm_Manny. So drag that out to get a human size reference to compare our landscape textures to. And we can place them right there. So this human, if I zoom in on the grass, we can see that probably the grass is a little bit too small. So let's fix that. Jump back into our landscape material, and the way we change the tiling of any textures is the exact same way we did with m_master material. So we grabbed the texture coordinates and we multiplied it by a parameter value, so we were able to edit it in the instance of this material. Now I could recreate this from scratch for m_landscape, or I can highlight all of that, press Ctrl and C, go back into m_landscape, and Ctrl and V it. Now I can plug this up to grass, and also I want to plug this up to the normal map of grass, which is right here. So if you remember, both this texture and this texture handle grass, since they're both being fed into the grass layers of the layer blend node. So press apply, and we won't notice any changes since we have to create a material instance of our landscape and apply it to the landscape. So right click, go create material instance, and drag this material instance onto our landscapes with the landscape selected. So just do that, and then double click on our instance. Let's undock it and bring it into the maps right there. Click on size, and I want to increase the size of my texture by decreasing the tiling. So instead of 1, let's try 0.5. Okay, that looks better. Maybe even 0.3. Okay, I really like 0.3. So this was beforehand at 1, and now this is the tiling at 0.3, which makes the landscape look better. Now I also want to add in tiling features for our dirt. So I can highlight this, press Ctrl C, Ctrl V, and paste it right there, and plug this up to dirt, and plug this up to normal map. But if I press apply and go back into our material instance, we have a pretty big issue right here. And that is, now our size controls both, and let's come over to the dirt, controls both our grass and dirt. And we want to control those independently. And the issue is in Unreal for material parameters. If you have two parameters with the same exact name, then they're going to be treated the same within the material instance. So the way you fix this is that you have to give each of these parameters a different name. So call this one size grass, and then call this one down here size dirt, and press apply. And now that should be different. So we also get the dirt parameter within our instance. So let's jump back into landscape example and press Shift and 2 to go into landscape mode. Select dirt because I want to paint a little bit of dirt right next to the mannequin so we can see what grass and dirt look like in relationship to our human scale reference. Now with dirt right there, let's go increase it to 0.3, maybe even 0. Actually, I think 1.2 looks good. So just a little bit more tiling with our dirt. If you are curious how to make a really good landscape material, I do have a landscape tutorial series on my YouTube channel. While it is for Unreal Engine 4, pretty much all of it still applies to Unreal Engine 5. That was the very basics of landscapes. Now we're going to go over how we can get assets from the Megascans library. So in case you don't know, Unreal already comes with thousands of free high-quality assets ready to be used immediately in Unreal Engine. We can get these assets through the Quixel Bridge plugin, which is already installed in Unreal. Before we jump into Megascans, let's make some edits to our world. So first off, I'm going to get rid of my landscape material since I think it's a little bit distracting and I just want to focus on the Megascan assets. So select my landscape, scroll down to the landscape material slot, and let's reset it back to the world grid by selecting the arrow right there. There we go, and I also want to lock my exposure with the post-process volume. So come into volumes, post-process, drag it out, and scroll up to exposure. Let's set it to manual and exposure compensation. Notice that there is no change right now because I need to make sure that infinite extend unbound is turned on. Now I can increase the exposure compensation. I found a value of 12 to be pretty good. And I'm also going to raise the position of my sun so we get more light in the world. Okay, so now that the sun was raised, notice that the brightness of the sun also increased. So exposure compensation, I'm going to lower it to 11. or 11.5. All right, great. So let's go over how we can get access to the Quixel Bridge library. And getting access is pretty simple. You just want to come up to the Add button and then select Quixel Bridge. Now, if this is your first time logging into Quixel Bridge, it might ask you to log into your Epic Games account. Don't worry, it's the same exact account that you created when downloading Unreal Engine. So just go into that, and then you get access to, right now at the time recording, 16,688 assets, which is absolutely amazing. Now, if for some reason you don't have Quixel Bridge installed in Unreal Engine, then you want to go to the Epic Games launcher and come to Unreal Engine library, scroll all the way down to Vault, and find the Quixel Bridge plugin. Once you found the Quixel Bridge plugin, click on Install to Engine and select Unreal Engine 5. Although by default, this plugin should be installed, so you shouldn't have this issue. But it's important to bring up just in case you don't see Quixel Bridge. Now let's open up Quixel Bridge and let's go over a simple example of bringing in a 3D object. So to bring in a 3D object is pretty simple. Number one, you want to find a 3D object that you like. So maybe this rock right here. Then all I have to do is select this rock, and let me make my screen window just a little bit smaller. Hold down the left mouse button and drag it into your world, just like if it's an asset from the content browser. And now we have our rock in our world. Importing realistic assets into Unreal Engine have never been this easy. And if I press Ctrl and Space, we can see in our content folder that 2 new folders were created, specifically Megascans and MS Presets. So Megascans contains all our Megascan assets that we get from Bridge. For example, we have a folder called 3D Assets, and inside 3D Assets, we have another folder called Mossy Forest Rock. And right here are all the assets that make up specifically this rock right here. Now, the other folder, if we go back to content, right next to Megascans is MS Presets. So MS Presets contains all the master materials that Quixel Bridge uses. So if we go out into content, back to Megascans, 3D Assets, Mossy Forest Rock, we'll see that the material that's using is a material instance. So it's not a material by itself. If I scroll down to the material instance, we can see what its master material is, and it's using m_ms default fuzz material. And if I click on the magnifying glass, it's going to jump to its location, which is of course under MS Presets, which contains all those master materials. And you'll also notice that we do get a bunch of parameters. So we're going to go over all the main material parameters that Quixel Bridge provides to us, which we will use consistently. So to begin, let's go over albedo controls. And I'm going to move my window off to the side so we can better see our assets. So albedo tint does exactly what the color tint does that we just created for our own master material. So I can completely change the color of my asset. I'm going to press cancel since I don't want to make any changes to my color right now. And below that is albedo controls. Now we don't see any albedo controls right now since I need to click on the triangle icon to get a drop down. So right here we have saturation, brightness, and contrast. And they all do exactly as you would expect. Saturation increases the saturation of our asset, bring it back to its default value of 1. Brightness controls how bright the asset is. And this is probably the parameter I use the most with Megascan assets, especially if I'm trying to get a lot of different assets to blend together well. I'm going to try to control the brightness to make sure they all have a similar value to each other. And below that is contrast. And all of these have a default value of 1. Now below that is metallic. Generally, I don't have to play with it because this asset isn't metallic. But if you do want to override one of the metallic behaviors, for example, increase the base metallic from 0, which is what it should be since this asset is a metallic, to 1, and then bring metallic map override to 0. Now we can see that the asset is metallic, although I wouldn't recommend you to do it, but it is good to know that those options are there. So I'm going to reset them to their default value. And then below that is roughness. So roughness controls how shiny the asset is, exactly what we learned about during the PBR section of the material chapter. So max roughness is at 1. If I bring this to 0, then the rocks have no roughness and are really shiny. I'm going to bring back the roughness by setting it back to 1. Below that is normal strength, which is like the flattened normal. Although now if we increase normal strength, the normal increases, and then if we decrease this to 0, then the normal map has no effect on our assets. So obviously we do want to leave this at 1, so the normal map has a little bit of an effect. So there's still a bunch of other parameters that we could play with, but these are all the main ones that are needed for props just like this. Now, let's go over how we import a surface material, which is different from a prop, since surfaces are good for a floor like this cube, and not necessarily meant for specific props. So let's go into Quixel Bridge, and let's find a nice surface. For example, brick, decorative brick wall, and we could click download, although I do want to go over the different quality options. So right now it's set to highest quality. We have low, medium, high, and highest. Low quality is 1K textures, medium quality is 2K, high quality is 4K, and highest quality is 8K. So I think generally, unless you're really trying to go for the best looking render as possible, I wouldn't go with 8K textures. The highest I would go with is 4K, and click download. So you're going to have to wait for this to download. And once it is done downloading, simply click the add button. Immediately, we will see that our content browser opens up and we get our material right there. The material functions like any other material. You can drag it and let go to place it on an object. So now we have our brick in our world. I can select this brick and open up its material instance to see what parameters we have, and the parameters are pretty much exactly the same as beforehand, except I want to point out what global does. So global controls our tiling. If I click on tiling offset and then click on the drop down, we see tiling X and tiling Y. If I want to tile it more on the X direction, I can increase this. If I want to tile it more on the Y direction, I can increase this, or I can decrease the tiling in the X and Y to make our texture larger. I can even offset it, so move this texture in the X or Y axis of our object's texture UVs. And if you really want to, we even have the ability to rotate this, although I'm just going to leave it at 0. If you ever want to reset all the values at once, then click on the top arrow. And here is a neat trick that I do want to point out. Let's say you want to go to the folder that this asset is located in, but you don't want to have to navigate to that folder manually, go through all your content folders, and try to find where this asset is located. Well, what you could do is in the details panel, click on the magnifying glass right next to that object, which will jump to that location, or the shortcut is to press Ctrl and B at the same time to jump to that object's location. So if you select any object, for example, the human reference, press Ctrl B, it's going to jump to that location. So that is a shortcut that we will be using a lot, especially when we're creating our medieval village. Now I think is a good time to go over the foliage mode. And to go into foliage mode, simply switch from select mode below landscape to foliage. So foliage mode is great because it allows us to paint foliage around our world very quickly and populate our world with grass, trees, rocks, and pretty much all the small assets you would expect to be in an environment. Now I'm going to press Shift 1 to get out of foliage mode because we first need foliage. And where are we going to get our foliage? Hopefully you could guess, Quixel Bridge. So in Quixel Bridge, come to 3D plants, and we have a bunch of plants to select from. I specifically want to find fern, just as an example, although you could pick any of the plants that are available to us. And I'm going to select common fern. Now, just like when we were downloading the materials, we have different quality options. So I could use low quality, which is 1K, medium quality 2K, or high quality, which is 4K. And I'm going to stick to high quality right now. Let's download it. And once it's done downloading, add to your project with the add button. And now this fern plant is successfully inside of our project. I can drag this out to see exactly what assets were made available to us. Unlike other Megascan assets, foliage can have multiple objects. So here we have 3 different ferns, and let's open up the material instance to see what options are available to us. We have a couple ways to open up our foliage's material instance. Number 1, I could go into the details panel with any of these selected and select the first material available to us, or I can press Ctrl and B to jump to that object's location, which is our fern folder, and select the material right here. I want to make sure that I select the material that doesn't have billboard inside of it. So select the non-billboard one, and this will be our main material instance. So I'm going to go over all the main parameters of foliage. So first off, we have color overlay, which is essentially functions just like our color tints. So if I want to make my foliage a little bit blue or red, this is where I make that change. And when I do make it red, it kind of gives it a fall feel, which is pretty neat. Press cancel since I don't want to make those changes. And right above that is color variation. Because you wouldn't expect each fern to be the same exact color. There would be a little bit of variation between all the different ferns, and that's exactly what color variation does. If I bring this up to something large like 0.5, notice how each fern has its own individual tint. Now normally you don't want it to be this intense. You'd want it to be just a little bit like 0.1 or even 0.05. So that there's just a little bit of variation between all the objects. And below that is roughness intensity. So roughness intensity is just like our master material's roughness strength. So bringing it down to 0 means our object is very shiny, and bringing it up to, let's go, 5, will make our ferns pretty rough. Let's leave it as default value of 1. And below that is normal intensity, which functions like normal strength. Bringing it to 0 gets rid of the normal maps. So this is with the normal maps and this is without. Or bringing it to 5 gives ourselves really intense normal maps. But I'm going to leave it at 1 for now, which is its default. And after that, we have translucency, strength, and desaturation. So light doesn't just stop when it hits a leaf. Instead, light goes into the leaf, it bounces around a little bit, and then it leaves the leaf. So that is where translucency comes in. Translucency is how much light should bounce around inside the leaf. It's at a value of 7. If I bring this to 0, then we have no light bouncing within the leaf. If I bring it up to 1, then a little bit, 2, a little bit more, 5, and finally the default of 7. And below that is translucency desaturation. Notice how if I bring it down to 0, then it becomes completely desaturated. Now the light inside the leaf is white. Or if I bring it to 1, then there was no desaturation when the light was bouncing in the leaf. So I'm going to leave it at the default value of 0.95. And finally, we have probably the most important parameter, and that is enable grass wind. So turn this on and then set it to true. So now our plants have wind, which adds a whole nother level of realism. We can control the wind intensity by, of course, playing with it right here. So if I bring it to 0, then there is no wind, and its default is 0.15. Maybe if we're inside a hurricane, make this 0.5, and now it's super intense. So I think 0.15 is a little bit too intense by default, so I'm going to bring this down to 0.05 for just some really faint movement. Now you probably noticed throughout this entire time is that the foliage pops a little bit as I go further away or closer up to it. And this popping is a level of detail. So we can better see level of detail by opening up the foliage in its static mesh editor. And right here, we have LOD. LOD 0 is what the foliage will look like when you're really up close to it. And actually, let me go uncheck the grid so we can better see this. LOD 1 is what it will look like when we get a little bit further away. When the camera gets even further, we go LOD 2, further LOD 3, and finally we go to LOD 4. And as we increase LODs, as the camera gets further and further away, we lose more and more geometry. Until we get this weird thing right here, which is essentially just a picture of the fern, which is pointing at the camera. So this material right here is what the billboard is. So that's why we weren't editing this material, since this material is completely different from our main material instance. If we did edit this, then we wouldn't see any changes right now in our world, since we're zoomed up pretty close to our ferns. We would notice a change if we're far away, and hopefully you can see it in YouTube. All of our ferns just transition to a billboard, which is the furthest LOD possible. So that's important to point out, that if you do make a major change to these ferns, for example, let's give them a color tint of blue. We have blue ferns, but if we go away, our billboards are green. So we also have to go into the billboard material instance, which is the second material, and change this color to blue to match the main material instance. So we get a better transition. Now, that looks terrible, so I'm going to change it back to its default value of gray, and right here, change it also back to gray. And I can exit out of all of these and save everything, because now that we've gone over the material parameters for foliage, we can talk about the foliage mode editor, which we can open with the shortcut Shift 3. Right here is where we get all the assets that I want to paint onto our landscape. We can see that it was already auto-populated by the foliage that we downloaded from Megascans. The reason why is because Unreal is smart enough and Megascans is smart enough to know that if we're downloading foliage, odds are we want to paint it. Now, if we don't have anything right here, then we could drag any 3D object into the foliage editor by just selecting them in the content drawer, hovering over, and adding them as a foliage type. Now, I'm not going to add them as a foliage type because they're already added right here. So if I select any of them, we see that I get a details panel down here with a bunch of options for how I want to paint this specific object. Now, if you do not see these options, that's because you have to come up here and make sure this button is blue. So to start painting, make sure you have paint selected, and you'll notice that nothing is happening. That's because I need to activate right here what foliage I want to paint down. So I need to tell Unreal exactly what assets I want to paint. So for example, if I just want to paint this asset right here, then hover over the assets icon, and in the top left hand corner, make sure it's turned on. So now this is going to glow while all the other ones are a little bit darker, and that tells me that I can paint it. So come to paint, and now hold down left mouse button, and I'm painting this foliage around. And wait a little bit for the shaders to compile. If I want to paint all three, then make sure all three of them are activated. So now I'm painting a lot of them down. If I ever want to get rid of these or erase a specific foliage type, make sure that foliage type is selected and hold down Shift to erase them. So it is pretty simple. I can decrease the brush size by coming up here, or I can use the shortcuts from the landscape mode, which are the left bracket key to decrease brush size and right bracket key to increase the brush size. I even have access to paint density. So right now it's at 0.5. If I want to paint down more foliage, then I can increase this to 1 and I'm painting a lot more. Or if I don't really want to paint that much down, then set to 0.1. I'm just going to paint a little bit. Hold down Shift, and I can always erase everything that I've already done. And of course, if you don't want to paint a specific foliage type, just make sure you have that unchecked. And now we're only going to paint this one and this one. So if you want to quickly select all the foliage types, then you can press Ctrl and A to select all. So in Unreal Engine, Ctrl A is select all. And then in the top left hand corner, you can uncheck it to uncheck them all, and then check it again to check them all. So that's a nice shortcut. And you can also hold down Ctrl to select multiple objects, or you can hold Shift to select objects in a row. So now that I have them all selected, I want to edit the properties down here, but I want to edit the properties all at once. So I'm going to press Ctrl and A to select all of them, and we have density down here. Bring paint density all the way up to 1. And we can see that, yeah, this is pretty dense, but what if I want this to be even more dense? Well, down here for density, I can increase this from 100 to 200. So this should be twice as dense. We can see that's already pretty dense. Even take this up another notch to 500. And now we are going to be painting in a lot of ferns. But these ferns still look a little bit unrealistic. And there's two reasons. Number one, I think the variation of our ferns is a bit too much. So let's jump back into our material instance. And for color variation, I'm going to lower that from 0.05 to 0.01. Okay, so that's better. But all the ferns have the same exact size. And plants never have the same exact size. Normally they have different sizes depending on where they're placed or how old they are in their lifespan. So let's jump back into foliage mode with Shift and 3 and select all of them. Now I'm going to delete them all. Scroll down, and for scale X, let's have a random range for each time we paint the foliage from 0.5 to a max of 2. So now if I paint, and actually hold down Shift, decrease the density from 500 to 100 so we can better see each individual fern, we will see that we have a very wide range of sizes. So some ferns are small and some ferns are larger than the other ones. Also, if you enjoy placing assets by painting them, but let's say, for example, there's one asset and you don't like where it's placed, but you don't want to delete all the assets that are around it, well, instead of using paint, you can use select, and then you can grab that individually and move it away. So you can still move individual objects and even scale them and rotate them despite using the paint mode. So just keep that in mind that you still have a lot of control over the placement of your objects. And it's also important to point out that, let's say, for example, I'm painting and I only want to paint on my landscape, and then I go on top of a mesh and then I start painting on top of my mesh by default. Also, when I now move this mesh around, we can see that that foliage is stuck to that mesh. So if you do not want that to happen, I'm going to press Ctrl and Z to get rid of that. Press Shift 3. Make sure under filters that static meshes is turned off. So now when I'm painting, I'm only painting on top of my landscapes and not on top of the static meshes. So that's the very basics of foliage in Unreal Engine 5. We're going to be painting a lot of foliage when it comes to our final environment build towards the end of this video. Now it's time to talk about one of the main features of UE5, and that is nanite geometry. So nanite geometry is a brand new way of rendering geometry that allows for a near infinite amount of source polygons on our screen at any time. So this means we could get high quality movie assets rendering in real time, which wasn't possible beforehand. And now I know that might sound a little bit too good to be true, so I have two examples we're going to jump into to demonstrate the power of nanite. Right now I have the Unreal Engine 5 demo project downloaded. You could download this project within the Epic Games Launcher under samples, and it's called Valley of the Ancients. So if you want to check this out, then you could download it right now. Although do keep in mind that this project is 100 gigabytes large since we're using really dense models because nanite allows us to do that. So this entire desert is made possible with nanite. And we can see nanite in action by coming up to lit, down here to nanite visualization, and selecting triangles. So every color you see is an individual triangle, is an individual polygon. And notice how when I zoom in on any of these rocks or cliffs, our triangles get denser and denser as I zoom in, and when I zoom out, the triangles get larger and larger. So this is all possible due to nanite. Beforehand in Unreal Engine 4, using geometry that is this dense was not possible. Now do keep in mind that at the time of recording this video, nanite only works for solid static meshes that do not deform. So for example, it works for rocks or for cliffs, but it doesn't work for foliage. Epic Games is aware of this issue and they're right now working on it. So maybe if you're watching this in the future, then nanite works for grass and trees. But for now, it only works for solid static meshes. And another cool feature of nanite, specifically for this sample project, is that, and if I increase my camera speed, there is no landscapes whatsoever. Everything you see right here is a nanite static mesh. So the ground is not a landscape. It's a collection of static meshes that are layered on top of each other to make it look like the ground is one landscape. So here's another example demonstrating nanite. So right in front of you is a donut I made in Unreal Engine, and this donut is made up of about 30,000 different polygons. Here we have that same donut, but copy and pasted over 100,000 times. And as we can see, my frame rate is about 5 to 10 frames per second, which is obviously unplayable. And the reason why is because these donuts aren't making use of nanite. So to enable nanite on any static mesh, simply find where that static mesh is within the content drawer. As a reminder, a shortcut is to select that static mesh and press Ctrl and B to jump to its location. And to activate nanite, right click on the static mesh, come up to nanite, and select enabled. So it is that easy to enable nanite. And now here's that same environment, but all the donuts are nanite. And we're hovering around 40 to 60 frames per second. So we went from 10 all the way up to 60 frames per second, which is amazing. We can even come up to lit, nanite visualization, and select triangles to double check that this is all using nanite geometry. So I finally jumped back into our first project. And as a reminder, to enable nanite, all you have to do is select the static mesh, press Ctrl and B to find out where that static mesh is within your content drawer, and right click and select enabled. Now Nanite is enabled for this asset. Here's a tip: we can see what assets have Nanite enabled by coming up to Lit, Nanite Visualization, and instead of clicking on triangles, which has been showing us how many polys are on a mesh, we can select Mask. So everything that's green is using Nanite, and everything that is red is not using Nanite. As a reminder, at the time of recording this video, Nanite only works for solid static meshes, like the rock right here. It doesn't work for foliage, although that will be changing. So maybe in the future, you can enable Nanite on foliage and make that a lot more performant than what it is right now. We can even download a Nanite version of this object. So Nanite will automatically be enabled from Megascans. To do so, let's hop back into Quixel Bridge. And I specifically want to download, let's go Nordic Formation. Type that in, and I think it is this mesh right here. So Nordic Beach Formation. And instead of selecting high quality, medium quality, or low quality, we will select Nanite quality and click on download. Now this will take a while since Nanite quality is downloading the best quality possible, which is a very, very high resolution mesh. And now that's downloaded, click on add. So a new window will pop up with your mesh. So I'm going to exit out of Bridge and drag this out into my world. It might take a while for all the shaders to compile. And we have a Nanite mesh. We can see how dense this mesh is by going into wireframe view mode with Alt and 2. So this is how dense a Nanite mesh is. Compare this to downloading a mesh at medium quality, like these rocks right here, compared to Nanite quality. Obviously, Nanite is a lot better. We get all this small detail within the rocks, which really helps make it realistic. The only issue is since we're downloading 8K textures and a high resolution mesh, it's going to take up a lot of disk space. But if you're not worried about large project files, then I would download everything as Nanite, since there is no performance cost, and in a lot of cases, it's actually more performant to use Nanite meshes than non-Nanite meshes. So here's what we're going to do, is that I want to compare all the different quality types that we're able to download from Megascans. So I'm going to jump back into Quixel Bridge and download this same asset, but download the low quality, medium quality, and high quality to compare them all. So here are all the different qualities for this asset. And to better see the difference between them, I'm going to press Alt and 2 to go into wireframe view mode. And our landscape is right now interfering with us analyzing the wireframes of our assets. So I can select the landscape and hide it with H. So H is a shortcut to hide an asset without having to navigate to it within the world outliner and selecting the eye icon. I can also press Ctrl and H to unhide an asset. So click on it, press H to hide it, and Ctrl H to unhide it. So I'm going to leave that hidden. And over here we have the lowest quality. It's pretty noticeable that there's not that many polygons on this asset. And the shadows from our directional light make it very noticeable that this asset is pretty low poly. Now right next to it is medium quality. So medium quality has a little bit more polys and it's at 2K while low quality was at 1K. And next to that is high quality. So high quality obviously has a lot more polys and the textures are also at 4K. And finally we get Nanite with 8K textures and the highest poly count possible. So this is the source poly counts that are directly from the scan. These are the kind of assets you would see in movies, not in video games. But because Nanite is enabled, we are able to use them in our project. So those are the different quality selectors. One thing I do want to point out is that notice if we pay attention to our high quality asset, as I zoom out, the polygons shift until I'm so far out that basically these three assets are using the same amount of polygons. That's because Megascan assets, when not using Nanite, use level of detail. So press Ctrl and H to unhide the landscape, and I can open up my asset by pressing Ctrl and B to jump to that asset's location in the content drawer, and then double clicking on the asset to open up the static mesh editor. Or as a shortcut, instead of having to navigate to the asset's location in the content browser, I can press Ctrl and E to open it up. So make sure you have any asset selected, for example, the medium quality one, and press Ctrl and E to open up that specific asset. Now I'm going to dock it up here so I get a better look at my static mesh. If I press Alt and 2 to go into wireframe view mode, zoom in, we see that this is the asset's highest poly version. And as the camera zooms away, it slowly starts to transition into lower and lower LODs. And we can see each of these individual LODs up here. So LOD 0 is the highest one, 1 is lower, 2 is even lower, and finally 3 is the lowest. So this is how we used to make our assets more performant back before Nanite. But since Nanite does exist, there really is no reason why I can select all 3 of my static meshes, press Ctrl and B to select all of them in the content drawer, right click, and enable Nanite. So save everything, and pressing Alt and 2, you see that we no longer get level of detail, but what we do have is automatic level of detail that's being generated from Nanite. So even when you have very low poly meshes, it's still recommended that you enable Nanite. Now it's time to start programming in UE5. And in case you forgot, Unreal Engine is a video game engine. So of course programming is going to be a pretty big part of it. But Unreal Engine handles programming a little bit differently compared to other video game engines. Instead of having lines of code we write to tell the engine what to do, we instead have blocks of nodes. And we connect these nodes to each other to create logic. These nodes in Unreal Engine are called blueprints, and blueprints is Unreal's visual scripting language. Now, in my opinion, blueprints are a lot easier and a lot faster than traditional ways of coding like in Unreal Engine, where we would have to type everything out using C++. Even if you don't plan on programming anything, I still highly recommend that you learn blueprints because blueprints is literally everywhere inside the engine. It's what we use to connect the different parts of the engine to each other. So it's an essential skill to know if you do want to learn Unreal Engine. And with all that being said, let's learn blueprints by creating our first video game in UE5. To begin, before we do anything, let's duplicate the current level we have open and create our game within our new duplicated level. So if we come up to the top left hand corner, we can see the name of our level, which is called Landscape Example. If you remember, we created it within My Stuff and Maps. So since Landscape Example and Landscape Example up there have the same exact name, that means that this level is the level we currently have opened. So I'm going to select that level and press Ctrl and D at the same time to duplicate. Now it's going to ask for a new name. I'm going to call this one Game Map. Now we can rename any assets within the content drawer by right clicking and going to rename. Also the shortcut is Fn2, but I like the current name, so I'm not going to do that. Now I'm going to double click and save selected to open up our new level. And here we have the map we will be editing to create our very first game. So to play a game in Unreal Engine, click the play button up here in the toolbar. So pressing it, we'll start playing our game. But we can't control our game right now since I need to click into the viewport, and now I get full control over the game. So I can press the escape key to stop playing my game. So to play a game, click the play icon, and to control the game, click into the viewport. We don't have our mouse anymore, and that's because to stop playing, you need to click on the escape key. So you probably noticed that our controls for our game were pretty basic, since it's just the WASD keys, just like the viewport controls. And that's because we don't have any characters or gameplay elements set up yet. So in order to set up a gameplay element, we first need access to the world settings. Right now we don't have any world settings tab. As a reminder, to get the world settings window, come up to Windows and select world settings. And now we're going to get a brand new window right here, which we can switch in between details and world settings. So right here we have game mode override. This is where we set exactly what game we want to play. And at the drop down, we should have BP underscore third person game mode. Now, if you don't have BP underscore third person game mode, that's because you didn't add the third person content yet, which is the content that includes this character right here. So if you want to get our character and our game mode, press Ctrl space, go to add, and add feature or content pack. And select third person, then click on add to project. Now I've already done that, which is why I get BP underscore third person game mode, which is located under one of the files that were created when I added in the third person content under third person and blueprints. So it's this one right here. Alternatively, instead of selecting it from the drop down, I can also hold down the left mouse button and drag it onto it and let go. So now if I press play, we see that we get a third person character. I can use the WASD keys to move around, space to jump, and the mouse to rotate my camera around my character. And as a reminder, I can press the escape key to get out. Alternatively, as a shortcut, instead of coming up to my toolbar and pressing the play button, I can press Alt and P to automatically play my game. So that's Alt and P to start playing my game without having to come up to the toolbar. And also notice how when I do click into my viewport, I no longer get access to the mouse cursor. If I ever want to get back the mouse cursor while playing my game, I could press Shift and F1 at the same time. So that's Shift F1 to bring back my mouse cursor. And instead of pressing the escape key, I could come up to the stop button and press that right there to escape my game. So let's open up our first blueprint. And specifically, the blueprint we're going to open up is the character blueprint we're right now controlling. So you can find the character blueprint by coming into third person and selecting blueprints. So it's right next to BP underscore third person game mode. It's BP underscore third person character. So double click on it to open up our first blueprint. Now we're currently on the event graph. Don't worry, we're going to go over what the event graph does in just a bit. But to see all the objects that make up our blueprint, select the viewport. Now, the objects that make up a blueprint are called components. And I can select a component just like on the level editor. Also, just like the level editor, we have the same exact controls. So I hold down the right mouse button to look around and move. And I can select any of the objects, press the F key to focus on it, hold down the Alt and left mouse button to rotate, and Alt and right mouse button to zoom in and out. So this is basically just like our level editor, but for our blueprints. Also, we have the equivalent of a world outliner. So on the top left-hand corner is the Components tab, which contains all the components inside of our blueprint. Just like an object in our world, I can select a component and change its properties in the Details panel. For example, right now we're using SKM underscore Quinn as our skeletal mesh, which is the female mesh. If I want to change it, I can select SKM underscore Quinn and then select SKM underscore Manny to change it to the male one. So now if I play my game, we can see that we have a different body. So now let's jump into the event graph. So the event graph contains all the nodes and blueprints, which makes up the programming or logic behind our third person character. Now, if you don't see an event graph, for example, if it's closed, then you could come into my blueprints and double click on event graph to bring it back. Also, we can move any of the windows just like in the level editor and change things to our liking. Now, if you mess up the user interface to the point of no return, then come up to Window, Load Layout, and Default Editor Layout to reset the windows to what Unreal has by default. We get an extra window under our event graph called Compiler Results. I don't need this, so I could click on the X icon, or as a shortcut, hover over the tab and press the middle mouse button to close it. So let's go over exactly what some of these blueprints do right here. So if I zoom in, for example, on the jump input, we can see exactly the logic that's behind jumping. So the logic is pretty simple. We have an event, which is essentially, at least in this case, functions as a keyboard press. So input action is jump. Right now it's set to the spacebar. So when I press the spacebar, our character jumps. And when I release the spacebar, our character stops jumping. And we can see this in action by clicking on the play button and pressing space. Now notice that I did spawn all the way over here, and that's because we don't have a player start within our world. So to add a player start, come up to the add button, go down to basics, and drag in a player start. So here we have a new object in our world. If I press play, our player starts from this location and also points in the direction of the arrow. So if I rotate this, for example, it's facing the rocks, and press play, now our player starts and spawns right there, pointing at these rocks. So if I jump back into BP underscore third person character and play our game, we start from this location. Now I'm going to press Shift and F1 at the exact same time to get back my mouse cursor, and I'm going to move the window to the top right hand corner so we can see exactly what is happening. So if I press space, we don't see visually what is happening within our event graph. So to see the blueprints running in real time, I could come up to No Debug Object Selected, and then select BP underscore third person character spawned. Now, if I zoom out on my event graph, notice how some of the wires turn from white to orange. These orange wires tell us that these nodes are currently being activated. If I zoom back into input action jump, and let's get back our character. If I press the spacebar, we can see that I jump, and then when I let go, we stop jumping. So jump and stop jumping. So this is a great way to debug and watch our logic running in real time, which is amazing, and it really speeds up the process of programming in Unreal. So let's create our first sequence of nodes. We're going to add in new functionality. Specifically, I want to add in the ability where when I press the F key, our character drops and it ragdolls. So we no longer have control over our mesh. Instead, we let the physics take control and watch his body fall over, similar to GTA or other games. So to do so, we first need to add in an event. Specifically, to add in any node to our graph, right-click, and we're able to type in the name of the node or manually scroll to that node's location right here. But obviously, there are a lot of nodes since we're able to program an entire game through blueprints. So something I like to do is type in the name. I'm going to type in keyboard because it's under keyboard events, and F since it's the F key, and select it. So now we get a new event that will be fired whenever I press the F key. To double check that this event is working, I'm going to add in another node by right-clicking and typing in print string. So to hook up two nodes and connect them to each other, hover over the output, hold down the left mouse button, drag into the input, and let go to connect them up. To break, hold down the Alt key and left mouse button in either the output or the input. So the controls are very similar to our material graph. And now within print string, we see that the string is going to be hello. Instead, I want to say event was fired, exclamation points. And we can get more options for this node by clicking on the drop down at the bottom of the node. And for text color, instead of blue, make this orange. So now, if I press the play button, click into my window to start playing my game. When I press the F key, the event is fired and print string is activated. So when I press F, then we get text onto my screen that says event was fired, which is what we just programmed. So I'm going to escape my game and delete print string, since that was just an example that I want to show, which proves that my event right now is working. So whenever I press the event key, all the nodes that are connected to pressed will be activated. So specifically, I want a new node. Now I could right click and type in the name of the node, which is set collision enabled mesh, and then hook it up like that. Or as a shortcut, I'm going to delete those and drag from pressed, let go, and it will automatically bring up my nodes. Now I can type in set collision enabled, select mesh, and they will automatically be connected. So that's another way to bring in nodes. And notice how this is two nodes. We have set collision enabled, and for target we have mesh. Mesh is a reference to the mesh component of our blueprint. So it's specifically referencing our character right there. Jump back into event graph, and if it's for some reason not hooked up by default, then I can drag mesh from the components window into my event graph, let go, and plug it up like that. But Unreal's smart enough to know that if we do want to set collision enabled, we probably want to do it to the skeletal mesh right here. Now, for new type, instead of no collision, select collision enabled query and physics. Don't worry exactly what this node does. I'm going to show what it does in just a moment. Now I want to connect another node from set collision enabled, which is set simulate physics, and specifically choose mesh, which will automatically connect our mesh to this new node. Make sure set simulate physics is turned on. Drag from here again and go set physics blend weight, and then select mesh. And for the blend weight, change it from 0 to 1. So as you can probably guess, these three nodes will essentially ragdoll our character. Pressing play again, I can run around my world, and then as soon as I press the F key, our character ragdolls and the physics take control. So let's do that again. I can run around, jump, and press the F key to ragdoll. We can better organize our graph because notice that the target for all three of my nodes is mesh. So we don't have to drag from an individual reference to mesh. We only need one reference to mesh. So I'm going to select these two, delete them, and drag out mesh into set simulate physics, and drag from the same one to set physics blend weight. I can also better organize my graph by hovering over any wires and double clicking to add in a reroute node. So simply hover over a wire, double click to bring in a reroute node, which doesn't change any of the logic. It just helps better organize our graph. And hold down Alt. So I'm going to break this connection and then drag from the reroute node into set physics blend weight, hover over the wire, double click, and bring that down like that to just better organize my graph. Now I can watch all three of them be enabled by clicking the play button. And let me go make my window just a little bit smaller. Make sure that BP underscore third person character is selected as the debug option. And when I press F, we can see all three of those nodes are activated and it gives us this ragdoll effect. Okay, so let's create a little obstacle course for our character. Jump back into game map and I want to create an elevated area where the obstacle course will be. So press Shift and 2 to go to landscape mode. Have sculpt selected and it's not that intense. So bring tool strength up to 1. And I'm going to keep sculpting until I find a height that I like. For example, right here is pretty good. Go into the flatten brush and then hover over the exact height that you want. Hold down the left mouse button to flatten that. So now I can create a little obstacle course area right here like that. And I think the edges are too sharp. So I can also go into smooth, bring down the tool strength, and slightly smooth out the area. So maybe even a little bit less strong. Just so that we don't get any artifacts from those sharp angles. And I could select my player start and drag it all the way up here. Or I can delete it and let's add in a brand new one. Come up to add, basics, player start, drag it in, and make sure it's pointing in the X direction. So now if I press play, our player starts right here, and they're going to have to navigate some obstacles until they get to the very end, and they win the game. So this is going to be the quickest and worst game made in history. So let's create our obstacle. And this obstacle is specifically going to be a blueprint. So press Ctrl Space, and let's create the blueprint under third person blueprints. Right click, and under create basic asset, select blueprint. And I want it to be an actor. So this name is going to be BP underscore obstacle. And you might be wondering, why do I use BP underscore? Well, BP stands for blueprint, and it's just naming convention. You could name this obstacle without the BP, but I like to include it. So double click to go inside of our blueprint. And this is what a completely empty blueprint looks like. So let's actually add in a new component, which will be our obstacle. So come to add and down to here, select cylinder. I want to decrease its width just a little bit and also increase it a lot in the Z axis. So I'm going to move this up so that the bottom is touching the grid floor and come back into game map. Let's go find where the obstacle is and drag it into our world. Also, it's recommended that you do press compile, which will set all the changes we made in the blueprint, but all blueprints will automatically be compiled when we press play. So come back into game map, press play, and here we have our first obstacle, and I want it where when the player touches it, he ragdolls, and we essentially die. So let's come back into our obstacle, and I need to add in a collision volume. So type in collision, and it's going to be a capsule collision. So select that right there. And I'm going to scale up this collision. So let's scale it up and make sure that the collision is larger than the cylinder. Because otherwise, if the collision is too small, for example, if it's smaller than the cylinder, then our character will collide with the cylinder first and never collide with the actual collision volume. So make sure that is a little bit larger than it is. And then in the details panel with collision selected, you want to select on component begin overlap. So this will be called whenever our collision comes into contact with an object. But right now, this event will be fired whenever it comes into contact with anything. So if it touches a plant, or maybe if we have birds in a game, it touches a bird, then this event will be fired, which is something that we don't want to happen. So we can get around that by dragging from overlap other actor and doing cast to BP underscore third person character and select that. So essentially what this casting is doing is that it's going to check if the overlapped object is a third person character. And then if it is, let's print string to double check that this is working. And for the string, say collided with character. So let's jump back into game app, press play. And now if I come up to it, we see top left-hand corner right here that we are colliding with the character, which is something we want. Now, I want it where when we do collide, our player ragdolls and dies. So jump back into BP_obstacle. Let's delete that. And casting also has the benefit that we get access to a lot of the properties that are within BP_third person character. So if we jump back into our character, I want to create a custom event right here. So this custom event will allow us to call all the nodes that we've already set up. So right click, type in custom event, and call this one death, just like that, and drag it into the start. So make sure you compile, because otherwise you will not see it. But if we jump into BP_obstacle and drag from our third person character, we now get access to the death event. So select it. We can now control when our player dies from another blueprint, which isn't our third person character. F was just being used as a debug event. I'm going to delete it because all we need is the death function. So if I press play now, if the player now collides with the obstacle, we see that as soon as I touch it, our player dies. So let's go do that again. Come to the obstacle, touch it, and he dies. So what's happening right now is that in BP_obstacle, as soon as the object touches the capsule collision, it's going to check if that object is a third person character. If it is a third person character, then we're going to call the custom event called death. Double click on the event to jump to where it's being created, which is in our third person character, and all these nodes ragdoll our character. Right now our obstacle isn't much of an obstacle. If I press play, it's very easy to avoid this pillar, since this pillar isn't moving. Now we can make this a little bit harder by adding rotation to the pillar. So let's jump back into BP_obstacle, and I'm going to specifically use the event tick. Now by default, every new blueprint does include an event tick right here. But in case you deleted the default events, you can always get back the event tick by right-clicking and typing in event tick and selecting it. So the event tick is pretty unique compared to other events in that it runs every single frame. So we can see this running in action by adding in a print string. And for the string, call this one activated. So now if I press play, we can see that every single frame activated is being called. So let's go delete that. And I want to use the node called add actor local rotation and select it right there. So plug it up like this, and we're not going to notice anything happening since we need to add a new local rotation. And I specifically want to increase, let's go the x-axis 5 degrees. So now if I press play, we see that every single frame, my obstacle is rotating 5 degrees. And while this is great, there's one issue, and that is it's frame dependent. So right now we're running at probably a smooth 120 frames per second. But what if this game was running on a computer that's not as powerful and it's running every 30 frames per second? Well, we can see what it's like to simulate that by pressing the backtick key to bring up the command line and type in t.max FPS and type in 30 to lock it to 30 frames per second. It's still rotating 5 degrees every frame, but we have less frames, so it's going to be rotating slower. So we need to make this frame independent. I can bring back my original frame rate by clicking on the backtick key again, typing in t.max FPS, and put in 0 to uncap the frame rate. And to do so, we need to use the delta seconds. So I'm going to drag from delta rotation and type in make rotator down here. So select that. And essentially the make rotator will break our rotation. So we get access to X, Y, and Z independently as inputs. So I'm going to drag from delta seconds and type in multiply like that and select it. So now the output will go into the X. And for rotation, we're going to set it back to 5. So if I press play again, and now we're going pretty slow. So I'm going to increase this from 5 to 100. Press play again. And our obstacle is rotating, I can lock this frame rate by clicking on the backtick key and type in t.max FPS. Let's lock it to 30. And notice that despite it being 30 seconds, we're still rotating at the same exact speed as beforehand. I can even try t.max FPS, 120 frames per second, and we have the same speed. So our gameplay is no longer tied to our frame rate, which is exactly what we want. Right now, all we have is one obstacle blueprint in our world. If I want multiple of them, I can select this blueprint and hold down Alt to duplicate it, or I can drag it out from our content drawer. Now, if I press play, we do have the issue, and that is they're rotating in the exact same direction. I can rotate each of these blueprints in a random direction on the Z-axis to give our rotations a little bit of variety. Now, if I press play, we're rotating in different directions, but it's pretty hard to tell exactly what direction it's going to be rotating on when editing our game in Viewport. To help us know the direction that we're rotating, jump back into BP_obstacle. Let's go to Viewport and click on Add, and we're going to add in an arrow component. So this arrow component, and I can zoom in to see exactly what it is, it will not be visible when we're playing our game, which is exactly what we want. So for arrow color, I'm going to set this to blue and also rotate this, let's go 90 degrees in the Z-axis and lift this up. So now if I compile, jump back into game map, we can see that I have a blue arrow that's pointing in the direction that my obstacle will rotate. So pressing play, I'm able to tell exactly where this object will rotate to. Now that I do have some obstacles, there's just one issue, and that is they're all going the same exact speed. I want some obstacles to be slower than others. So I want to be able to edit that property in the details panel of the blueprint. So to do so, I need to make a variable. And variables are pretty similar to a materials parameters. So let's jump back into event graph. And under variables, I can create a new one by clicking on the plus icon. So call this one rotation speed. And instead of Boolean, I can change it up here to a float. So a float is a number with decimal points. Now I can hold down the left mouse button and drag out rotation speed, let go inside of my event graph, and it's going to ask me whether I want to get it or set it. I want to get the rotation speed and plug it up right there. So instead of 100, we're going to be using whatever value is stored within the rotation speed. So you can essentially think of variables as containers of data. Now, when we do have rotation speed selected, we're unable to change that value because our blueprint needs to be compiled. So as soon as I press compile, I now get access to that value. It's set at 0, so if I do play my game, we aren't rotating. Now I can bring this back to 100. And if I play my game, we have the same exact speed. But that's not the point of variables. Variables are great because they allow us to change the default value. So I want to expose this variable. That's how I'm able to edit it within the details panel of my object. Make sure that you have rotation selected, and in the details panel, check instance editable and expose on spawn. Now if I press compile, jump back into game map, we can see that when I do have an obstacle blueprint selected, rotation speed is made available. So I can make this obstacle right here have a speed of 50, this one a speed of 200, and right there, let's go 300. Now if I press play, they all have different speeds. So it makes it a lot harder to try and navigate this obstacle course. We are right now missing a very crucial element to our game, and that is an end goal. So the goal that I want the player to try to reach is specifically under starter content, props, SM_statue. So the player is trying to make it to the statue, and I'm going to change the material from glass to gold. So starter content, materials, and drag metal gold onto the glass like that. Now, when the player, and I'm aware that you can just walk around the obstacle course, I want to add in the feature where when the player is by the statue, we get a windscreen telling us that we did beat the game. To begin, let's add in a trigger volume, which will trigger whenever the player is near the statue. So to do so, come up to add, and under volumes, select the trigger volume. So I'm going to drag it out and place it so that it's around the statue. We want to program it where whenever the player collides with this trigger volume, then a win screen will pop up. We're going to program this logic through the level blueprints. So every level in Unreal Engine has its very own blueprint, where we're able to script logic that is very specific to the level. So to open up your level blueprint, come up to the blueprint icon right here, select that, and then select Open Level Blueprint. Now this is the event graph that is specific for Game Map. We can even see that the name of this blueprint is Game Map, which is different from BP_obstacle or our third-person character, since it's not an individual object, instead it's the level as a whole. Now, I'm going to delete our default custom events, and I want to make sure that in my level editor, I have the trigger volume selected. So with it selected, I'm able to get a bunch of different properties and events that are related to the trigger volume. For example, if I right click, we can see that add event for trigger volume 3, and under collision, we get the event that I want, which is add on actor begin overlap. If you do not see any of these options, then you want to make sure that you do have your trigger volume selected in the map. So right click, add event for trigger volume collisions, and add on actor begin overlap, which is essentially a very similar event to our on component begin overlap. So we want to do the exact same thing we did right here, and that is make sure that we are overlapping with the third person character. So drag from other actor and cast to third person character and select it right there. Now I want to make sure that this event is working by dragging from this node and printing string. So the sentence that I want to come up is "You won the game!" exclamation point. So ideally, pressing play, I'm going to walk around my obstacle course. We will fix that in a bit. And as soon as I come into contact with the trigger volume, we see in the top left-hand corner, we get the string "You won the game." Now let's create a win screen. So to create a user interface, let's press Control and space. And I'm going to create it under third person blueprints. Right click, under user interface, select widget. So user interfaces in Unreal are called widgets. And I'm going to select user widget under common. Now it's going to ask me to name this widget. I'm going to call this one win screen widget, and then double click to go inside of it. So this will be very brief. It's not a proper introduction to the widget editor, since all I want is a little bit of text that will come up once we do beat the game. So to begin, in the palette, I'm going to type in canvas and drag in canvas into my graph, let go. The green outline is essentially our window. Now I'm going to type in text and drag in text into my graph. So I want to center my text. That's what's in the middle of my screen. And then in the details panel, let's go change the text to "You won the game!" exclamation point. Also under appearance, click on the font drop down and increase the size. So the text is very noticeable. I'm actually going to decrease it just a little bit more. And I want to move this flower icon into the middle of the screen. That's how my text is anchored. So my text will always be in the middle of the screen, no matter the size of my window. So press compile and let's save everything. Now jump back into game map. And I'm going to delete this print string, since now we have a proper win screen. Drag from here and create a widget. Of course, the widget we're going to create is the one that we just made. So win screen widget. And drag from here, then add to viewport. Since by default, it will be hidden, we need to show it. So now, if I play my game, go around my obstacle course, and I collide with the collision of my statue, we see that I just won the game. And congratulations, you just made your first video game in Unreal Engine 5. While it's not the best, hopefully you did learn the very basics to programming using blueprints. Real quickly, let's fix the game so our player can't run around the obstacle course. So press Shift 2 to go back into landscape editing mode, select flatten, and flatten it out so the player only has one direction or one way to go to get to the statue. And also select all the obstacles, hold down Alt, and I'm going to rotate them around and move them like this. So there are multiple objects the player has to dodge. And I'm going to delete one of the obstacles in the middle to make our game a little bit easier. and move the player start. Since if I press play, I just get dropped from the play space. Move the player start so it's resting on top of the landscape. Press play. And now the goal is to try to make it past all the obstacles and not get hit. And at the very end, we see you won the game when I get to the statue. Now at this point, we have all the knowledge needed to create this beautiful castle environment you see right here. In this last chapter, I will walk through the entire process. We will start off by sculpting and painting the landscape. And then we will move on to creating the castle using modular assets. Finally, we'll paint trees and foliage. And at the end, add a third-person character to our world so the player can walk around our finished environment. While you can follow this tutorial exactly, I highly encourage you to experiment and create your own unique environment. Use this video as a reference and veer off the path to make this world your own. Since after all, you are not creating my environment, you're creating your own one. But before we can do that, a quick word from our sponsor. Just kidding, we don't have a sponsor, but if you do want to support the channel, then you can check out the Unreal Masterclass. The Masterclass is an expanded